David Martinez clutched his daughter's hand as they walked past the gleaming corporate tower where he'd just been humiliated. The CEO had screamed at him for 20 minutes about his inflexibility as a single father, her voice echoing off marble walls while security guards smirked. But in the corner of that boardroom sat an elderly woman in a simple cardigan, saying nothing, watching everything. David didn't know she was the CEO's mother. He didn't know she'd built this company from nothing while raising 5 children alone. He didn't know that his quiet dignity in refusing to compromise his daughter's needs had just changed both their lives forever. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. David Martinez sat in the sterile waiting room on the 42nd floor, his daughter Sophia asleep against his shoulder. Her small fingers still clutched the coloring book they'd brought for what was supposed to be a quick interview. The receptionist's all sharp angles and practiced smile shad stopped looking in their direction after the first 30 minutes. "Mr. Martinez?" The voice cut through the ambient hum of the office. A woman in an expensive suit stood at the glass doors, her expression unreadable. "Yes." David gently shook Sophia awake. "Come on, mija." Sophia blinked, confused. "Are we going home now, Papa?" "Not yet, baby. Remember what we talked about?" She nodded solemnly, gathering her crayons with the careful precision of a 6-year-old who'd learned to be invisible in adult spaces. The woman led them through a maze of cubicles and conference rooms. David noticed how the conversations died as they passed, how eyes followed them with a mixture of curiosity and pity. A single father with his child in tow, not exactly the image of corporate reliability. "Ms. Hartwell will see you now." The boardroom stretched before them like an airplane hangar. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made David's stomach lurch. He'd grown up in those streets below, in apartments where the heat barely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every dream deferred. Victoria Hartwell stood with her back to them, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't care if the Shanghai office is hemorrhaging money. Fire whoever needs to be fired and get it fixed." She turned, ending the call with a sharp tap. "Mr. Martinez." She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. Her gaze flicked to Sophia, then back to David, and something shifted in her expression. "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing," she gestured vaguely. "My daughter." "I explained to HR that I might need to bring her if childcare fell through." "Right." Victoria's smile was razor thin. "Please, sit." David pulled out a chair for Sophia, who climbed up and immediately began arranging her crayons in rainbow order. He sat beside her, hyper-aware of how out of place they looked in this temple of glass and steel. In the corner of the room, almost invisible in the shadow of a potted plant, sat an elderly woman. She wore a simple gray cardigan and sensible shoes, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her presence was so unobtrusive that David almost missed her entirely. "That's my mother," Victoria said, following his gaze. "Eleanor Hartwell. She likes to observe." Eleanor nodded politely but said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and David noticed the calluses on her fingers-working hands, incongruous in this polished environment. "Let's get started." Victoria opened a leather portfolio. "Your resume is impressive. 5 years at Morrison Tech, excellent performance reviews. But then there's this gap. I was caring for my wife during her illness. She passed away 18 months ago." The words still felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd never wanted to learn. "I'm sorry for your loss." Victoria's tone suggested professional obligation rather than genuine sympathy. "But that brings us to the practical concerns. This position requires travel, potentially 60% of your time on the road. I understand that. But I'd need accommodations for what exactly? Victoria's voice sharpened. Mr. Martinez, this is a senior developer position. We're not running a daycare. Sophia looked up from her coloring book, sensing the tension. David reached over and smoothed her hair. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for flexibility where possible. Work from home options when travel isn't essential. Video conferences instead of in-person meetings when feasible. What you're asking for is a completely different job than the one we're offering. What I'm asking for is to do the same job, while being a responsible parent. Victoria leaned back in her chair, and David could see the calculation in her eyes. The weighing of his skills against his inconvenience. Let me be clear about something, she said. We hired your predecessor because he was available 24/7. No questions, no complications. He didn't need to leave early for soccer practice or miss client dinners because of babysitter issues. He also left you for a competitor after 18 months, David replied quietly. According to your job posting, you've had 3 people in this role in 2 years. Victoria's eyes flashed. Are you suggesting our retention problems are due to unrealistic expectations? I'm suggesting that good developers want work-life balance, and parents often make the most dedicated employees because we understand responsibility. Responsibility? Victoria stood abruptly, her voice rising. Let me tell you about responsibility, Mr. Martinez. I've built this company from the ground up. I work 18-hour days. I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. That's responsibility. Sophia shrank back in her chair, and David felt his jaw tighten. And I've raised a child alone while building a career, he said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. I've held her hair while she threw up from the flu, then worked until 3 a.m. to meet a deadline. I've taught her to read while debugging code. That's also responsibility. This is ridiculous. Victoria turned to pace behind her chair. You're basically holding your child hostage to get special accommodations. I'm not holding anyone hostage. I'm being honest about my situation. Your situation is a liability. The words hung in the air like smoke. David glanced at Sophia, who had stopped coloring entirely and was watching the adults with wide, confused eyes. Papa, she whispered. He squeezed her hand gently. It's okay, mija. But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. You know what? Victoria was hitting her stride now, her voice echoing off the glass walls. I'm tired of candidates who think the world owes them something. This is business, not a charity. If you can't commit to the job as described, then maybe you should look elsewhere. Maybe I should. David stood, his movement slow and deliberate. He began packing Sophia's crayons back into their box, each one placed with careful precision while his daughter watched. That's it? Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. You're just going to walk away? I'm going to maintain my dignity. Your dignity? She laughed, a harsh sound that made Sophia flinch. Your dignity isn't going to pay your rent. Your dignity isn't going to put food on your table. David paused, a red crayon halfway to the box. When he looked up, his eyes were calm but distant. My dignity is all I have left to give my daughter, and it's not for sale. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at him, her chest rising and falling with agitation. In the corner, Eleanor Hartwell sat perfectly still, but David caught something in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even approval. You're making a mistake, Victoria said finally. Maybe. David helped Sophia down from her chair. But it's my mistake to make. He turned toward the door, his daughter's small hand in his. They'd made it halfway across the room when Victoria's voice stopped them. "Don't expect any references from this company." David paused but didn't turn around. "I wouldn't dream of asking." The door closed behind them with a soft click. In the elevator, Sophia pressed her face against David's leg. "Papa, are you sad?" He looked down at her, this perfect little person who trusted him to make the right choices, to keep her safe, to show her how to move through a world that didn't always make room for people like them. "No, Mija," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "I'm not sad." The elevator descended through the floors, carrying them away from the glass and steel, back down to street level where real life waited. As they walked past the building's gleaming facade, David felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of rightness, of alignment between his values and his actions. The job would have been good money, better benefits than he could find elsewhere. But some prices were too high to pay. "Can we get ice cream?" Sophia asked, tugging on his hand. David checked his phone, 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. They had nowhere urgent to be, no schedule to keep. For once, the freedom felt like possibility rather than uncertainty. Why not? They found a small shop 2 blocks away, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a menu written in chalk. Sophia chose strawberry with rainbow sprinkles, and David got vanilla classic, uncomplicated. As they sat at a wobbly table by the window, watching the city move past in all its chaotic beauty, David felt his phone buzz. A text message from an unknown number. "This is Eleanor Hartwell. Would you be available for coffee tomorrow morning? I have a proposition that might interest you." David stared at the screen, trying to process the words. Eleanor Hartwell, the quiet woman in the corner, Victoria's mother. How had she gotten his number? Sophia was chattering about something, her face already sticky with ice cream, completely unaware that their day had just taken another unexpected turn. David looked out the window at the corporate tower, rising above them like a monument to ambition, then back at his daughter's happy face. Tomorrow would bring its own surprises. But for now, this moment was enough. The coffee shop Eleanor had chosen was nothing like the sterile corporate environment where they'd first met. Tucked between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner, it had the worn comfort of a place that had witnessed countless conversations over decades. David arrived 10 minutes early, Sophia in tow because Mrs. Chen, his usual babysitter, had called in sick. He debated bringing her. The text from Eleanor had been professional but cryptic, and he wasn't sure what kind of meeting this would be. But the alternative was canceling, and something about the older woman's quiet presence in that boardroom had intrigued him. Sophia claimed a table by the window, spreading out her coloring book with the territorial confidence of a regular customer. David ordered her chocolate milk and a muffin, then waited. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather bag that looked older than David. She'd traded yesterday's cardigan for a navy blazer, but the same sensible shoes clicked against the worn linoleum as she approached their table. "Mr. Martinez, thank you for coming." She sat across from him, her movements economical and precise. "And you must be Sophia." Sophia looked up from her drawing a house with windows that looked like eyes and a door that seemed to smile. "That's a beautiful house," Eleanor said. "Does someone special live there?" "Me and Papa," Sophia replied without hesitation. "And maybe a dog someday, if we find the right one." Eleanor smiled, and David caught a glimpse of warmth that had been carefully hidden in the boardroom. "Dogs are excellent judges of character," Eleanor said. "They never choose the wrong family." She turned to David, her expression becoming businesslike again. "I apologize for yesterday. My daughter can be intense. She was protecting her company. I understand that." "Do you?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, Because what I saw yesterday wasn't protection, it was fear. David frowned. Fear of what? Of being seen as weak. Of making accommodations that might be perceived as softness. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. Victoria believes that ruthlessness equals strength. It's a lesson she learned from watching me build that company. There was something in her voice, regret, maybe, or recognition of a mistake made long ago. You built Hartwell Industries? 43 years ago. Started in my kitchen with a typewriter and $500 borrowed from my sister. Eleanor's eyes grew distant. I had 5 children under 10, and a husband who'd just walked out. Victoria was the oldest, barely 8 years old, but she helped with the babies while I worked 18-hour days. Sophia looked up from her coloring, sensing something important in the adult conversation, even if she couldn't follow the details. Victoria remembers those years, Eleanor continued. She remembers me crying over bills, missing her school plays, falling asleep at the kitchen table over spreadsheets. She learned that business means sacrifice. That success requires choosing work over everything else. But you succeeded. I survived. Eleanor's correction was gentle but firm. There's a difference. David watched her carefully. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected when he'd agreed to meet. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophia color. The little girl had moved on to drawing flowers around the house, daisies and roses mixed together in impossible colors. Because yesterday, in that boardroom, I saw something I thought I'd forgotten. Eleanor's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I saw a parent who understood that some things matter more than money. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a manila folder. This is a business proposal. Not a job offer, a partnership opportunity. David opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Financial projections, market analysis, and at the top, a simple business plan for a software consulting firm. I don't understand. 3 months ago, I began divesting my holdings in Hartwell Industries. I'm 76 years old, Mr. Martinez. I built that company to provide for my family, but somewhere along the way, it became something else, something harder. She gestured toward the folder. I want to try again, smaller this time. Smarter. With someone who understands that business should serve life, not the other way around. David felt his pulse quicken. You want me to start a company with you? I want to back your company. Silent partner, initial funding, access to my network of contacts. You handle the technical side and day-to-day operations. What's the catch? Eleanor smiled. The catch is that we do business differently. Flexible schedules for employees with families. Parental leave that actually lets parents parent. Success measured not just in profit margins, but in whether people can go home at night and be present for the people they love. Sophia had stopped coloring and was listening now, her 6-year-old instincts picking up on the shift in her father's energy. David shook his head. This is incredibly generous, but I don't understand why you'd take this kind of risk on someone you barely know. Because I know the most important thing about you. Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. I know you walked away from my daughter's offer yesterday. Not because you couldn't use the money I can see from your clothes, your shoes, the careful way you budget even this coffee that you need the work. You walked away because you refused to compromise your principles. She leaned forward slightly. Do you know how rare that is? In 43 years of business, I've seen people sell their ethics for much less than Victoria was offering. But you chose your daughter over financial security. You chose integrity over convenience. David glanced at Sophia, who was now drawing what looked like a swing set in the yard beside the house. I chose survival, he said quietly. If I'd taken that job, I would have become someone she couldn't respect. And if she can't respect me, I've lost the only thing that matters. Exactly. Eleanor's eyes lit up. That kind of clarity is rarer than any technical skill. I can teach business strategy, market positioning, client relations. I can't teach character. The weight of the offer settled on David like a blanket, warm but heavy with possibility and risk. What about Victoria? This is still her company, at least partially. Victoria will have her opinions, but the beautiful thing about being 76 is that I've stopped caring whether my children approve of my choices. Eleanor's smile was mischievous. Besides, she'll come around. Eventually. Sophia tugged on David's sleeve. Papa, can I have another muffin? Please, mija. And yes, as David signaled the waitress, Eleanor watched the interaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that the small moments revealed everything about a person's character. There's one more thing, Eleanor said when Sophia was distracted by her second muffin. I'd like you to think about what kind of company you want to build, not just the services you'll offer, but the culture, the values, the legacy you want to leave for her. She nodded toward Sophia, who had muffin crumbs on her chin and was humming while she colored. I built Hartwell Industries to escape poverty, but I'm afraid I created something that traps people in a different kind of poverty of never having enough time for what matters. David looked at the business plan again, seeing not just numbers and projections, but possibility, a chance to create something that honored both ambition and humanity. I need to think about this. Of course, take your time. Eleanor stood, gathering her bag. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. She paused at the table's edge, looking down at Sophia's drawing. That's a lovely home you've drawn. Very welcoming. Sophia beamed. Would you like to visit sometime? We don't have a dog yet, but Papa makes really good pancakes. Eleanor's composure cracked just slightly, and David saw a flash of something vulnerable beneath the businesswoman's facade. I would like that very much, she said softly. After Eleanor left, David and Sophia sat in comfortable silence. The coffee shop bustled around them with the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday morning, students hunched over laptops, retirees sharing newspapers, mothers juggling toddlers and caffeine. Papa? Sophia looked up from her drawing. Is the nice lady going to help us? David considered how to answer. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes salvation comes disguised as coincidence? That sometimes the universe offers second chances through the kindness of strangers? Maybe, mija. What do you think about that? Sophia tilted her head, considering with the seriousness that children bring to important questions. I think she has sad eyes like you did after Mama went to heaven, but also happy eyes, like when you make pancakes on Sunday. Out of the mouths of babes, David felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Should we go home and talk about this? Sophia nodded, carefully tearing her drawing from the coloring book. Can we give this to the nice lady next time we see her? I think she'd love that. As they walked home through the familiar neighborhood streets, David felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The safe choice would be to keep looking for traditional employment, to take whatever accommodations he could get and make the best of it. But Eleanor's offer wasn't just about business, it was about possibility. The possibility of building something that aligned with his values. The possibility of showing Sophia that work and family didn't have to be in constant conflict. The possibility of creating the kind of company he wished had existed when he'd sat in that sterile waiting room, hoping against hope that someone would see him as more than a liability. Their apartment building came into view, its red brick facade warm in the morning sun. As they climbed the 3 flights to their unit, Sophia chattering about dogs and pancakes and nice ladies with sad, happy eyes, David realized that for the first time in 18 months, he was looking forward instead of just surviving. The business plan waited in his messenger bag, full of numbers and projections and possibilities. But the real decision, he knew, had already been made the moment he'd walked out of that boardroom with his dignity intact. The apartment felt smaller when decisions loomed large. David sat at his kitchen table after Sophia had gone to bed. The business plan spread before him like a map to an unknown country. The numbers were generous, more generous than he had any right to expect. But numbers were the easy part. The hard part was faith. His laptop hummed quietly beside the papers, cursor blinking in an empty email draft. He'd started 3 different responses to Eleanor, deleted them all. How do you thank someone for seeing potential in your failures? How do you accept a gift that feels too large to carry? The apartment was quiet except for the familiar sounds of Mrs. Rodriguez's television through the thin walls and the distant hum of traffic. This place had been their refuge after Maria died, small enough to afford on one income, close enough to Sophia's school that she could walk if needed. It was temporary, he'd told himself. A stepping stone to something better. But temporary had stretched into 18 months, and stepping stones had begun to feel like permanent ground. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother Carlos. "How'd the interview go yesterday? Still nothing back?" David stared at the message. Carlos meant well, but explaining yesterday felt impossible. How do you describe watching your pride get dissected in a boardroom? How do you explain walking away from security because it came wrapped in humiliation? He typed back. Something unexpected came up. "We'll call you tomorrow." Another buzz. This time from his mother. "Mijo, I'm making tamales Sunday. Bring Sophia. And maybe it's time to think about coming back to Phoenix. The schools here are good, and you know your father could use help with the business. The escape route his family had been offering for months. Move back home, work for his father's small construction company, let his parents help raise Sophia. Safe, predictable. Everything yesterday's opportunity was not. David closed his phone and walked to Sophia's bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to see her sleeping form. She'd arranged her stuffed animals in a careful circle around her pillow, her nightly ritual since Maria's death, a protective barrier against the dark. On her nightstand sat the drawing she'd made at the coffee shop, carefully placed where she could see it first thing in the morning. The house with eyes for windows and a door that smiled. Simple and hopeful, like its artist. He thought about Eleanor's question. What kind of legacy do you want to leave for her? The answer had been forming all day, shaped by small moments and large realizations. He wanted to leave Sophia a world where parents didn't have to choose between being good employees and good people, where flexibility wasn't seen as weakness but as strength, where dignity was not a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. But wanting and achieving were different countries entirely. David returned to the kitchen table and opened his laptop. This time, the words came. "Dear Eleanor, thank you for your generous offer and for seeing something in me that I'm still learning to see in myself. Your proposal represents everything I hoped to find in yesterday's interview and more than I dared to imagine possible. I accept. I have conditions, though I hope you'll see them as clarifications rather than demands. I want to build a company that proves business can be both profitable and humane. I want flexible schedules not just for parents but for anyone who needs to care for family members. I want success measured in client satisfaction and employee retention, not just quarterly profits. Most importantly, I want to create something my daughter can be proud of when she's old enough to understand what we built. If these align with your vision, I'd like to discuss next steps. If not, I understand, and I'm grateful for the chance to dream bigger than I have in months. Respectfully, David Martinez P.S. Sophia asked me to tell you that our door is always open for pancakes and dog visits, whenever you're ready." He hit send before doubt could intervene. The response came faster than he'd expected. David, your conditions are not conditions, they're exactly why I chose you. Can you meet me at the office tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Not Victoria's office, mine. I still keep a small space on the 7th floor, mostly for sentimental reasons. We have work to do. And tell Sophia I'll bring coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for the architect of that beautiful house. Eleanor P.S. I may know someone with a dog looking for the right family. David read the message twice, then closed the laptop and went to pour himself a small glass of the whiskey he saved for occasions good and bad alike. Tonight felt like both. The next morning brought October rain and Sophia's excited chatter about the nice lady with the dog, maybe. David had explained as much as a 6-year-old needed to know. Eleanor had offered him a chance to start his own business, and they were going to talk about it today. Will we be rich? Sophia had asked over breakfast. We'll be okay, David had answered, which was the most honest thing he could offer. Eleanor's office occupied the southeast corner of the 7th floor, with windows that looked out over the city rather than down on it. The space felt lived in rather than designed bookcases stuffed with actual books, family photos mixed with business awards, a coffee maker that had seen decades of use. Eleanor sat behind a desk that had clearly been built for function rather than intimidation, reading something on her laptop with the focused attention of someone half her age. David, Sophia. Welcome to where it all started. Sophia's attention was immediately captured by a glass bowl of peppermints on the side table. Eleanor noticed and smiled. Help yourself. They're there for people who need something sweet while we talk about serious things. While Sophia carefully selected a mint, Eleanor poured coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for the child, moving with the economy of someone who had hosted countless meetings in this space. I've been thinking about your email, Eleanor said, settling into her chair, particularly about measuring success in retention rather than just profit. Do you know what our employee turnover rate was last year? David shook his head. 47%. Victoria sees it as natural selection, the weak leaving so the strong can thrive. I see it as hemorrhaging institutional knowledge and human potential. She pulled out a tablet and swiped to a presentation. I've spent the last 3 months analyzing our most successful projects. Want to guess what they had in common? Good leadership, stable teams. Projects led by people who'd been with us for years, working with colleagues they trusted, serving clients who saw us as partners rather than vendors. Eleanor's finger traced a graph on the screen. The correlation between employee satisfaction and client outcomes is undeniable, but Victoria sees retention efforts as coddling. Sophia had finished her hot chocolate and was exploring the office with the careful curiosity of a well-behaved child. She stopped at a wall of photographs, studying them with intense concentration. Eleanor? Sophia's voice was small but clear. Is this your family? Eleanor joined her at the photo wall. Some of them. That's Victoria when she was about your age, and those are her brothers and sisters. Sophia pointed to a picture of a much younger Eleanor, surrounded by 5 children in what looked like a kitchen. You look tired. Eleanor's laugh was soft and sad. I was tired. Very tired. But happy too? Eleanor studied the photo with fresh eyes. Yes, happy too. David watched this exchange with growing understanding. Eleanor wasn't just offering him a business opportunity, she was trying to rewrite history, to create the company she wished had existed when she was a single mother, juggling 5 children and 18-hour workdays. The development timeline, David said, returning to business. How quickly do you want to launch? That depends on how quickly we can find the right people. I'd rather start small with a team that shares our values than rush to market with whoever we can hire. They spent the next hour discussing practicalities, office space, initial client outreach, hiring criteria. Sophia colored at a small table Eleanor had set up for her, occasionally offering observations that were surprisingly insightful. "Papa," she said during a discussion about work-from-home policies, "if people can work at home sometimes, they can make lunch for their kids." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "What else would make people want to work for us?" Sophia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. Nice bathrooms. And maybe plants. Plants make everything better. Eleanor made a note on her tablet. Nice bathrooms and plants. I think we can manage that. As the meeting wound down, Eleanor walked them to the elevator. "David, I want you to know that this won't be easy. We're challenging a business culture that's been decades in the making. There will be people who see our policies as weakness, our flexibility as unprofessional. I understand. Do you? Because my daughter will likely be one of those people. Victoria and I don't always see eye to eye on business philosophy." The elevator arrived, and they stepped inside. As the doors closed, Sophia looked up at Eleanor with the directness that only children could manage. "My papa says doing the right thing is hard sometimes, but that's what makes it right." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Your papa is a very wise man." The elevator descended through the floors, carrying them down from the world of meetings and presentations to the street level where real life waited. As they reached the lobby, Eleanor touched David's arm. "I have one more thing for you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. For Sophia. Sophia unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small picture frame containing the drawing she'd made at the coffee shop, the house with eyes for windows and a smile for a door. "I had it framed," Eleanor explained, "because I think every architect should have their first design properly displayed." Sophia hugged the frame to her chest, her face glowing with the pride of being taken seriously by an adult. As they walked toward the subway station, David felt something he hadn't experienced since before Maria's diagnosis, the sensation of moving towards something rather than away from it, the feeling of building rather than just surviving. "Papa?" Sophia tugged on his hand. "I like Eleanor. She listens the way you listen." David squeezed her small fingers. "How do I listen?" "Like what I say matters." 3 blocks from their apartment, David's phone rang. Victoria Hartwell's name appeared on the screen. He hesitated, then answered, "Mr. Martinez." Victoria's voice was clipped, professional. "I understand you've been meeting with my mother." "Yes." "I want you to know that I think this partnership is a mistake. Not because of your qualifications, those speak for themselves, but because business and sentiment don't mix well." David stopped walking, letting Sophia run ahead to look at a dog tied up outside a coffee shop. "With respect, Ms. Hartwell, I think business without sentiment is what got us into this mess in the first place." "What mess?" "The one where talented people leave good companies because they can't find a way to be both successful and human." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You walked away from my offer," Victoria said finally. "I did." "Why?" David watched Sophia petting the friendly dog, both of them delighting in the simple interaction. "Because some things matter more than money. And any company that can't understand that isn't a company I want to work for." Another pause. "My mother thinks you're going to change the world. Your mother is generous with her optimism." "My mother," Victoria said slowly, "is rarely wrong about people." The call ended without goodbye, leaving David staring at his phone and wondering if he'd just gained an ally or made an enemy. Sophia skipped back to him, full of news about the dog's name and temperament and the likelihood that it would make a good addition to their household. "Not yet, Mija," David said, taking her hand. but maybe someday soon. That evening, as Sophia arranged her stuffed animals in their protective circle and David tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with the solemn expression she wore when asking important questions. "Papa, when we have our new business, will we still have time for pancakes?" David smoothed her hair, marveling at how she'd distilled his greatest fear into such a simple question. "Especially time for pancakes," he promised. "That's the whole point." Sophia smiled and closed her eyes, already dreaming of houses with smiling doors and dogs and pancakes on Sunday mornings. David stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep and thinking about the leap of faith that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new opportunities to succeed or fail. But tonight, in the quiet of their small apartment, with his daughter safe in her bed and possibility stretching out before them like an uncharted road, David Martinez felt something he hadn't experienced in too long. He felt ready. 6 weeks later, David stood in the empty office space on Morrison Street, watching Sophia trace patterns in the dust motes that danced through the afternoon sunlight. The space smelled of fresh paint and possibility 2,000 square feet that would become home to something unprecedented. "It needs plants," Sophia announced, echoing her earlier advice to Eleanor. "And maybe a reading corner." "A reading corner in an office?" "For when people need to think quietly." Mama always said thinking required the right kind of quiet. David felt the familiar ache that came with Sophia's casual mentions of Maria, but it was softer now, edged with gratitude rather than just loss. Maria would have loved this, the audacity of starting over, the hope wrapped in uncertainty. Eleanor emerged from what would become the conference room, tablet in hand and a satisfied expression on her face. "The contractor says we can have everything finished by the 15th. That gives us 2 weeks to hire our first employees before the Morrison project begins." Their first client had come through Eleanor's network, a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to overhaul their inventory management system. It wasn't glamorous, but it was substantial enough to prove their model could work. "Any word from the candidates we interviewed yesterday?" Sarah Chen accepted. "She starts Monday." Eleanor smiled. "Apparently, our parental leave policy convinced her to leave her current job. She's been trying to adopt for 3 years." David nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Sarah was brilliant, a systems architect with 15 years of experience who'd been passed over for promotions because she'd been open about wanting to start a family. Her previous employer's loss would be their gain. And Marcus? Still deciding. "I think he's waiting to see if this is real, or just an elaborate experiment." Marcus Rodriguez was a project manager who'd been laid off when his last company decided that human resources was better handled by algorithms. He'd been unemployed for 8 months, growing increasingly cynical about corporate promises of work-life balance. Sophia had wandered into what would become the main work area, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She stood in the center of the room, arms outstretched, spinning slowly. "What are you doing, mija?" "Checking the happiness level." Eleanor looked puzzled. "The happiness level?" "Mama taught me. You stand in the middle of a place and spin with your arms out. If it feels like flying, it's a happy place. If it feels like falling, it's not." Sophia stopped spinning and considered the results with the seriousness of a professional consultant. "This is definitely a flying place." Eleanor's eyes misted slightly. "I think your mama was very wise." The afternoon dissolved into practical details: furniture delivery schedules, its setup, the small decisions that would shape their daily reality. David found himself grateful for Eleanor's experience navigating the bureaucracy of starting a business, even as he appreciated her willingness to defer to his vision for the company culture. They were discussing the employee handbook when David's phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen for the third time that week. I should take this. He stepped into the empty reception area, leaving Eleanor and Sophia to debate the merits of standing desks versus traditional workstations. Miss Hartwell, we need to talk. Victoria's voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. Can you meet me tonight? 7 o'clock at Meridian. Meridian was the kind of restaurant where business deals were made over $100 steaks and carefully orchestrated power plays. Not David's usual territory. Is there a problem? There might be. Just come alone. The line went dead, leaving David staring at his phone and wondering if their fragile beginning was about to face its first real test. That evening, David sat across from Victoria in a booth designed for privacy and intimidation. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of people who made decisions that affected other people's lives. Victoria had already ordered wine, something expensive that she drank like medicine. "You're wondering why I called," she said without preamble. The thought crossed my mind. Victoria leaned back, studying him with the calculating expression he remembered from their first meeting. But something was different, now less hostile, more uncertain. "I've been watching what you and my mother are building. The hiring decisions, the policies, the whole philosophy. And I think you're making a mistake." David had expected this conversation for weeks. What kind of mistake? "You're assuming that treating employees well automatically translates to business success. But kindness doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Martinez. Flexibility doesn't meet deadlines. Good intentions don't satisfy clients who expect results." The waiter appeared with their meals, Victoria's salmon barely touched, David's pasta growing cold while they talked. "Can I ask you something?" David set down his fork. "When was the last time you went home before 8 o'clock? That's not relevant. When was the last time you had dinner with friends? Read a book that wasn't business-related? Took a vacation without checking email?" Victoria's jaw tightened. Success requires sacrifice. Whose definition of success? The question hung between them like a challenge. Victoria took another sip of wine, her movements controlled but somehow brittle. "You know what I think?" David continued, his voice gentle despite the tension. "I think you're terrified that we might be right. Because if we prove that business can be both profitable and humane, it means you've been sacrificing pieces of yourself for nothing." "You don't know anything about my sacrifices." "You're right, I don't. But I know about mine." David pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of Sophia asleep at his desk the night before, her coloring book serving as a pillow, while he worked late on project specifications. "I could have put her to bed and worked until midnight. I could have arranged overnight care and maintained perfect separation between work and family. But then I would have missed her telling me about the dream where she and her mother were planting a garden together." Victoria stared at the photo, something shifting in her expression. "Some moments matter more than profit margins," David said quietly. "And the beautiful thing about building our own company is that we get to decide which moments those are." They sat in silence for several minutes, the restaurant's ambient noise filling the space between them. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. "I haven't taken a real day off in 3 years. Why?" "Because—" She paused, searching for words. "Because I learned that the moment you show weakness, someone takes advantage of it. The moment you prioritize anything over work, you lose ground you can never recover." "Who taught you that?" Victoria's smile was bitter. "Life. Experience. Watching my mother work herself into exhaustion to keep us fed and housed. And now I work myself into exhaustion to keep a company profitable that could probably run itself." David studied her face. seeing past the polished exterior to something raw and tired underneath. You could try something different. Like what? Like trusting that the people around you want the company to succeed as much as you do. Like believing that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's sustainable. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Easy advice from someone who's never had to fire 100 people because of a bad quarter. You're right. I haven't. But I've had to explain to my 6-year-old daughter why Mama wasn't coming home from the hospital. I've had to choose between paying for her prescriptions and keeping the lights on. I've learned that some kinds of strength come from admitting what you can't control. The admission seemed to surprise them both. David rarely talked about the hardest parts of Maria's illness, the impossible choices that had shaped his understanding of what truly mattered. "How do you do it?" Victoria asked quietly. "How do you stay optimistic when everything is uncertain?" David thought about Sophia spinning in the empty office, checking the happiness level of their future. "I don't stay optimistic. I stay present. I focus on what I can control, how I treat people, how I show up for my daughter, whether I can look at myself in the mirror at the end of the day and feel proud of the choices I made." Victoria finished her wine and signaled for the check. "I came here tonight to warn you that business partnerships with family are complicated, that my mother has a history of emotional decision-making that doesn't always serve the bottom line. And now I'm wondering if maybe the bottom line isn't the only line that matters." They walked out into the October evening, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain. Victoria's town car waited at the curb, but she made no move toward it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "That day in the boardroom, when I raised my voice, what were you thinking?" David considered the question, remembering the anger and humiliation of that afternoon, but also the clarity that had emerged from it. "I was thinking that my daughter was watching me, learning what it looked like when someone tried to make you choose between your dignity and your security. And I wanted her to see that some things aren't for sale." Victoria nodded slowly. "I was 8 when I first saw my mother cry over a client who'd refused to pay an invoice. She'd put everything into that project, and losing that money meant we might lose our apartment. What did you learn from that? That trusting people was dangerous. That showing vulnerability was a luxury we couldn't afford." Victoria's voice was barely audible above the city noise. "But watching my mother build that company also taught me that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not trusting people." The car door opened, and Victoria's driver stepped out, waiting respectfully. "Your mother sees something in our partnership," David said. "Maybe it's worth finding out what that is." Victoria paused with her hand on the car door. "The Morrison project starts in 2 weeks. If you succeed with that, if you prove that your model can handle real pressure and real deadlines, I'll consider adjustments to how we operate at Hartwell Industries. And if we fail, then I'll have been right about sentiment and business not mixing well." She slid into the car, then rolled down the window. "For what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong." The car pulled away, leaving David standing on the sidewalk with the taste of possibility and risk mingling in the crisp air. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Chen, his babysitter, to check on Sophia. "She's fine, mijo, working on a puzzle and asking when you'll be home. Tell her 10 minutes. And Mrs. Chen? Thank you." "For what?" "For making it possible for me to have meetings like this without worrying about her." The subway ride home gave David time to process the evening's conversation. Victoria's challenge felt less like a threat and more like an opportunity, a chance to prove that their principles could withstand the pressure of real business demands. He found Sophia at the kitchen table, surrounded by puzzle pieces that depicted a family of bears having a picnic. She looked up when he entered, her face brightening. "Papa, I saved you the sky pieces. They're the hardest, but you're good at hard things." David sat beside her, studying the scattered blue pieces that would eventually form clouds and atmosphere. "How was your day, mija?" "Good. Mrs. Chen taught me to make empanadas, and I told her about our new office with the plants we're going to get. What kind of plants do you think we need?" Sophia considered this with her usual seriousness. "Green ones. And maybe some that flower, so people remember that beautiful things can grow anywhere." David found a corner piece of sky and clicked it into place. "That's very wise. Mama used to say that gardens need both sunshine and rain to grow. What do you think that means?" "That good things come from all kinds of weather." As they worked on the puzzle together, David felt the rightness of the path they'd chosen settling around him like a comfortable coat. The Morrison project would be challenging, the pressure intense. But they would face it with integrity, surrounded by people who understood that success meant more than just profit. The sky pieces slowly came together under their patient hands, creating something complete and beautiful from fragments that had seemed impossible to connect. Outside their apartment window, the city hummed with its endless rhythms of ambition and hope, struggle and triumph. Somewhere in that maze of lights, Eleanor was probably working late on project specifications. Somewhere else, Victoria might be questioning everything she thought she knew about business and success. And here, in this small kitchen, where empanadas had been made and puzzles solved, and a father and daughter had spent another evening building their understanding of the world piece by careful piece, David Martinez felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow would bring them closer to the company they were meant to create. A place where sky pieces and ground pieces could coexist in the same beautiful picture. The Morrison project went sideways on a Tuesday. David sat in the emergency meeting room at Morrison Manufacturing, watching their client's IT director pace back and forth like a caged animal. The inventory system they'd spent 8 weeks building had crashed during the morning shift changeover, taking half the plant's production schedule with it. $47,000 in lost productivity, Jim Morrison was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. 47,000 in one morning. Sarah Chen typed furiously on her laptop, running diagnostics while Marcus coordinated with the plant floor supervisors. David forced himself to stay calm, to project the confidence their small team needed while his mind raced through possible solutions. "The core system is stable," Sarah reported without looking up. "The crash happened in the integration layer, something in the legacy interface." "How long to fix it?" Morrison asked. "We need to identify the specific conflict first," David said. "Give us 2 hours to run a full diagnostic." 2 hours? Morrison's face reddened. "We're losing money every minute this thing is down." "I understand the pressure, Mr. Morrison, but if we rush a patch now, we risk making the problem worse." Morrison stopped pacing and fixed David with the kind of stare that had probably intimidated suppliers and employees for decades. "You know what, Martinez? This is exactly why I don't work with small companies. When the real pressure hits, you fold." The words hit harder than they should have, echoing Victoria's warnings about sentiment and business not mixing well. David felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations, the crushing awareness that his team's reputation and Eleanor's faith in him hung in the balance. "We're not folding," David said quietly. "We're being thorough." "Same thing in my book." Sarah looked up from her laptop, catching David's eye. He saw his own anxiety reflected there, mixed with determination. She'd left a secure job for this opportunity, trusting that their promises about work-life balance meant something. Now those promises were being tested against the harsh reality of client expectations. "Marcus," David said, "can you coordinate with the plant supervisors to implement manual tracking for the next 2 hours? Sarah and I will focus on the fix." For the next 90 minutes, David and Sarah worked with the focused intensity of surgeons operating on a critical patient. They traced code paths, analyzed error logs, and slowly pieced together the cascade of failures that had brought down the system. The problem turned out to be elegant in its simplicity: a date format conflict between Morrison's 30-year-old legacy system and their new inventory tracker, the kind of issue that was invisible until specific conditions aligned, then catastrophic when they did. "Got it," Sarah announced, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "The legacy system expects menu DD YYY format, but our integration assumes DD menu YYY. When the day and month values are both valid, it works fine. But today's the 13th month. 13 doesn't exist in the old system, so it throws an exception." David felt relief wash over him. "How long to fix?" 20 minutes to code the format converter, 10 minutes to test, 5 minutes to deploy. "Do it." 35 minutes later, the Morrison manufacturing inventory system hummed back to life. Production schedules updated, workers returned to their stations, and the crisis that had threatened to destroy their reputation became a footnote in a successful project. Jim Morrison watched the screens populate with real-time data, his expression gradually shifting from anger to grudging respect. "Not bad," he admitted, "though I still say 2 hours was too long." "Mr. Morrison," David said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Would you rather we'd rushed a fix that might have failed again during tonight's shift, or taken the time to solve the problem correctly?" Morrison considered this, then nodded slowly. "Point taken. But next time, communicate better. Tell me what you're doing, and why." The silence made me nervous. As they packed up their equipment, Sarah approached David with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction on her face. "That was intense." "Welcome to consulting," David replied. "You did great work in there. I kept thinking about what you said during my interview, that pressure reveals character. I wanted to make sure mine was worth revealing." The drive back to their office gave David time to process the morning's events. Crisis management wasn't new to him. He'd navigated plenty of technical emergencies in his previous jobs. But this felt different. This time, he wasn't just protecting his own career, he was stewarding something larger, something that other people had invested their hopes in. He found Eleanor in the main work area, reviewing project timelines with Marcus, while Sophia colored at her designated desk in the corner. They'd set up a small workspace for her after school, and during school breaks, complete with her own computer loaded with educational games and art programs. "How did it go?" Eleanor asked, looking up from her tablet. "Crisis averted, systems running smoothly." "And Morrison?" "Grumpy but satisfied." Sarah identified the problem, we fixed it properly, and we learned some valuable lessons about client communication. Eleanor smiled. "Crises have a way of clarifying what matters. How's the team holding up?" David glanced around the office at Sarah, documenting the morning's fix for future reference, at Marcus, updating their crisis response protocols, at Sophia, concentrating on a drawing that appeared to feature dogs and office buildings in equal measure. "Better than I expected." That evening, David's phone rang as he and Sophia were cleaning up after dinner. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. "Hartwell. I heard about Morrison." David paused, unsure whether this was congratulations or condolences. "Word travels fast. Jim Morrison and I play golf together. He called this afternoon to complain about his morning, then ended up praising your team's work." "Oh." "He said you kept your head under pressure and solved the problem right the first time. He also said he's recommending your services to 2 other companies." David felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "That's good news." "It's more than good news. It's proof of concept." Victoria's voice carried a note he hadn't heard before, something that might have been respect. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For assuming that doing business with integrity was the same as doing business poorly." Sophia looked up from her coloring book, sensing the importance of the conversation, even if she couldn't follow the details. "Apology accepted," David said, "though I hope you know we're just getting started. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I'd like to propose something." Victoria explained her idea over the next 10 minutes, a partnership between their companies that would let Hartwell Industries employees access the kind of flexible work arrangements that David's company was pioneering, a pilot program that could benefit both organizations while testing whether their principles could scale. "What does Eleanor think about this?" David asked. "I haven't talked to her yet. I wanted to run it by you first." "Why?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Because you were right about something. The day you walked out of my boardroom, you said some things aren't for sale. I've been thinking about that. And I've realized I've been trying to buy things that can't be purchased. Loyalty, dedication, the kind of commitment that makes people stay late not because they have to, but because they care about the work." Sophia had abandoned her coloring and was now listening openly to David's side of the conversation, her 6-year-old curiosity engaged by the serious tone. "Those things have to be earned," David said. "Exactly, which is why I want to learn how you're earning them." After the call ended, David sat at the kitchen table processing the conversation while Sophia returned to her artwork. The drawing had evolved during the phone call. The office building now had windows filled with smiling faces, and the dogs were no longer just playing but appeared to be working alongside the people. "Papa, is the angry lady not angry anymore?" David considered how to explain the complexity of Victoria's transformation to a 6-year-old. "I think she's learning that being angry all the time is very tiring, like when I'm mad about bedtime." "Exactly like that." Sophia nodded sagely. "Maybe she needs more sleep." The next morning brought a surprise visitor. David arrived at the office to find Eleanor and Victoria sitting in the conference room, their body language suggesting a conversation that had been both difficult and necessary. "David," Eleanor called out when she saw him. "Perfect timing. Victoria has a proposal." As Victoria outlined her partnership idea, David watched the family dynamics play out in subtle gestures and careful words. Years of business disagreements had created a formal distance between mother and daughter, but underneath the professional courtesy, he could see genuine affection struggling to reassert itself. "The pilot program would start with our development team," Victoria explained. 25 people who've been pushing for more flexible arrangements. We'd implement your policies for 6 months and measure the results." "What kind of results?" David asked. "Employee satisfaction, retention rates, project completion times, client feedback, everything we can quantify. And if the results are positive?" Victoria exchanged a look with Eleanor. "Then we consider expanding the program company-wide." The meeting stretched into the afternoon as they worked through details, reporting structures, success metrics, communication protocols. It was complex negotiations made more challenging by the personal history between Victoria and Eleanor, but David found himself impressed by both women's commitment to finding common ground. "There's one more thing," Victoria said as they wrapped up. "I'd like to propose a joint project, something that would let our teams work together on a real client engagement." "What kind of project?" "Morrison Manufacturing wants to expand their system to 3 additional plants. It's a big enough job that we could staff it jointly, your people handling the technical architecture, mine managing the broader implementation." David felt the weight of opportunity and risk settling on his shoulders. Success would validate everything they'd built and open doors to larger projects. Failure would damage both companies and potentially end their partnership before it truly began. When would this start? Next month, if you're interested. David looked around the conference room at Eleanor's encouraging smile, at Victoria's carefully controlled hope, at the walls where they'd hung Sophia's architectural drawings alongside their business plans and client testimonials. Through the window, he could see Sophia in the main work area, teaching Sarah how to fold origami cranes while Marcus pretended to need instruction in the ancient art of paper folding. "I'm interested," David said, "but I have one condition." "What's that?" "We do this our way. No compromising on the values that got us here. If we're going to prove that business can be both profitable and humane, we have to stay true to those principles even when the pressure mounts." Victoria nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, David and Sophia sat on their apartment building's fire escape, watching the city lights twinkle below them. It had become their ritual on important days, a chance to process the changes in their lives while maintaining perspective on what truly mattered. "Papa, are we going to be okay?" The question surprised him. Sophia rarely worried about their financial security anymore, having adapted to their new stability with the resilience of childhood. "What makes you ask that, Mija?" Today felt like when we moved out of the old apartment, like everything was changing again. David understood. The partnership with Victoria, the expanded projects, the growing complexity of their business relationships, it all represented change. And change had been synonymous with loss in Sophia's young life. "Do you remember what Mama used to say about change?" Sophia thought for a moment. "That it's like seasons. Sometimes it's winter and everything looks dead, but spring always comes if you wait long enough." "And what season do you think we're in now?" Sophia looked out over the city, considering the question with her usual seriousness. "Spring," she said finally. "Definitely spring." A breeze rustled through the fire escape, carrying the scents of the city exhaust and coffee, ambition and hope, the complex perfume of millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. "Papa?" "Yes? I think Eleanor and Victoria are going to be okay too." "What makes you say that?" "They look at each other the way you and Mama used to look at each other when you thought I wasn't watching. Like they love each other but forgot how to show it. From the mouths of babes." David squeezed his daughter's hand, marveling at her ability to see past the complications adults created to the simple truths underneath. Below them, the city hummed with its endless rhythms of commerce and connection, ambition and affection. Somewhere in that maze of lights, people were making choices about what mattered most: success or integrity, profit or principles, the quick win or the long-term vision. As they climbed back through the window and began their nightly routine of pajamas and bedtime stories, David felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd chosen well. The path ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities to succeed or fail, but they would face whatever came with their values intact and their relationship strong, and sometimes that was the only victory that truly mattered. 3 months into the joint Morrison expansion project, David learned that success could be more complicated than failure. The 3 additional manufacturing plants were coming online ahead of schedule. Employee satisfaction scores at Hartwell Industries had jumped 23% since implementing the flexible work policies. 2 major competitors had reached out about licensing their integration protocols. By every measurable standard, their experiment in humane business practices was succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought complications. David stood in the Hartwell Industries boardroom, the same one where Victoria had humiliated him 7 months earlier, facing a room full of executives who'd flown in from corporate headquarters. Their questions were sharp. their skepticism barely concealed behind professional courtesy. "Mr. Martinez," said a woman with steel gray hair and predatory eyes, "these flexibility policies you've implemented, how do we know they scale? What works for 25 employees might collapse under the weight of 2,500. "We're tracking productivity metrics across all participating teams," David replied, keeping his voice steady. "Performance has improved in every measurable category. Short-term improvements, perhaps. But what about long-term sustainability? What happens when employees start taking advantage of your accommodations?" The word accommodations carried a weight of disdain that reminded David uncomfortably of his first meeting with Victoria. He glanced at her now, sitting at the far end of the table. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he caught a flicker of something's apport, maybe, or shared frustration. "In our experience," David said, "employees who feel trusted and respected are less likely to take advantage of that trust, not more." Another executive, this one younger, with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested recent promotion, leaned forward. "That's a nice philosophy, but business isn't run on trust, it's run on accountability." "How do you measure accountability when people work from home 3 days a week?" Eleanor spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Perhaps we should ask Jim Morrison that question. His productivity numbers speak for themselves. Jim Morrison runs a manufacturing operation, blue-collar workers, union contracts, traditional structures. That's entirely different from managing knowledge workers." David felt his patience beginning to fray. These were the same arguments he'd been hearing in various forms for months. The assumption that treating people well was somehow incompatible with running a profitable business. "With respect," he said, "I think you're creating a false choice. The idea that we have to choose between treating employees well and achieving business results assumes that people are fundamentally lazy or dishonest. My experience suggests the opposite." The steel-gray woman smiled without warmth. "Your experience is limited, Mr. Martinez. You've been running your company for less than a year. Some of us have been managing people for decades." The condescension was delivered with surgical precision, designed to diminish his credibility while maintaining plausible deniability. David recognized the technique he'd seen it used against contractors, vendors, anyone who lacked the corporate pedigree to command automatic respect. "You're right," David said quietly. "My experience running a company is limited, but my experience being an employee spans 15 years. I know what it feels like to choose between my child's school play and a client meeting. I know what it's like to work for people who see flexibility as weakness and loyalty as something to be extracted rather than earned." The room went silent. David could feel Victoria's eyes on him, measuring his response to pressure. "I also know," he continued, "that the best work I've ever done happened when I felt supported rather than monitored. When I trusted my employer to treat me like a human being rather than a resource to be optimized." The younger executive leaned back in his chair. "That's a touching personal testimony, but business decisions can't be based on feelings. Can't they?" Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Because last quarter, the teams using David's policies had lower turnover, higher client satisfaction scores, and beat their delivery targets by an average of 8%. One quarter doesn't establish a trend. Neither does decades of assumptions about what motivates people." The meeting continued for another hour, but David could feel the battle lines hardening. The executives from corporate headquarters saw their pilot program as a dangerous precedent proof that employees might demand better treatment across the entire organization. They were here to contain the experiment, not expand it. As the room emptied, Victoria approached David with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That was well done." "Was it?" I felt like I was speaking a foreign language. "You were." the language of treating people like people instead of profit centers. Victoria paused. It's not a language my colleagues speak fluently. Will this kill the partnership? Victoria glanced toward the door where the other executives had disappeared, probably already planning their report to the board of directors. Possibly. But David? Yeah? I'm glad you didn't back down. That evening, David found himself in the unusual position of having to explain corporate politics to a 7-year-old. Sophia listened with the focused attention she brought to important topics while they prepared dinner together. So the angry business people don't like that Papa's company is nice to people? It's more complicated than that, Mija. They're worried that being nice will cost too much money. Sophia considered this while carefully measuring pasta into the boiling water. But Papa, if you're mean to people, don't they leave? Sometimes. And then, don't you have to find new people and teach them everything? Yes. That sounds like it would cost more money than just being nice in the first place. David paused in his chopping of vegetables, struck by the elegant simplicity of her logic. You know what, Mija? You're absolutely right. Can I tell the angry business people that? I think they might need to figure it out for themselves. The next morning brought news that David had been expecting but hoping to avoid. Eleanor called as he was dropping Sophia off at school. The board meeting is today. Victoria's flying to New York to present our results and defend the partnership. What are our chances? Honestly, I don't know. The numbers are on our side, but numbers don't always win these fights. David spent the day trying to focus on client work while his phone stayed stubbornly silent. Sarah and Marcus sensed the tension, offering encouragement and support even as they prepared for the possibility that their partnership with Hartwell Industries might end before it truly began. Victoria's call came at 6:47 p.m. It's done. David's heart sank. They killed the partnership? No, they expanded it. For a moment, David couldn't process the words. What? They're implementing the flexible work policies across all North American operations. 6,000 employees. They want you to oversee the rollout. David sank into his desk chair, trying to wrap his mind around the magnitude of what Victoria was saying. How? I thought they were ready to shut us down. They were, until I presented them with the real numbers. Victoria explained what had happened in the boardroom 12 floors above Wall Street. The detailed analysis she'd prepared, the cost-benefit calculations that proved their model wasn't just humanate was profitable. The client testimonials, the retention statistics, the productivity improvements that couldn't be dismissed as statistical noise. But the real turning point, Victoria said, was when the CEO asked me directly whether I believed this approach would work long-term. What did you tell him? I told him about watching my mother build a company while raising 5 children alone, about learning that success meant sacrifice, that caring about people was a luxury successful businesses couldn't afford. Victoria's voice grew quiet. Then I told him about watching you walk away from a job offer because you refused to compromise your principles. About seeing what happened when someone built a business around trust instead of fear. And I told him that for the first time in my career, I want to come to work every morning instead of feeling like I have to. The call ended with promises to discuss implementation details in the coming days. David sat in his empty office as the city lights began to twinkle outside his window, trying to absorb the reality of what they'd accomplished. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Mrs. Chen made tacos for dinner. Come home soon. The heart emoji was a recent addition to her texting vocabulary, deployed with the strategic precision of someone who understood that small gestures of affection could transform ordinary moments into something special. David gathered his things and headed for the subway, his mind already shifting from the victory they'd won to the challenge that lay ahead. Scaling their principles across 6,000 employees wouldn't be easy. There would be skeptics to convince, systems to build, countless small decisions that would either reinforce their values or slowly erode them. But as he walked through the familiar streets toward home, David felt something he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage to Mariathi, sensed that he was part of something larger than himself, something that might actually make the world a little better. He found Sophia and Mrs. Pramsaswan Chen in the kitchen, the older woman teaching his daughter the finer points of proper taco assembly, while Spanish guitar music played softly from the radio. "Papa!" Sophia launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm that never failed to remind him why all the corporate meetings and business partnerships mattered so much less than this moment. "Good day at work, mijo?" Mrs. Chen asked, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who'd raised 6 children and understood the hierarchy of importance in life. "Very good day." As they sat around the small kitchen table sharing tacos and stories from the bastion, their respective days, David felt the profound contentment that came from knowing he'd found a way to be both a good father and a successful businessman. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been guaranteed, but they'd proven it was possible. Sophia was in the middle of describing an elaborate playground negotiation involving swings, slides, and the complex social dynamics of second grade when David's phone rang. Eleanor's name appeared on the screen. "I should take this, Mija, but keep telling me about the playground politics." "David." Eleanor's voice carried a warmth he'd never heard before. "I wanted to call before you saw it in tomorrow's news." "Saw what?" "Victoria announced her resignation as CEO today. She's starting her own consulting firm, focused on helping companies implement humane workplace policies." David felt his world shift slightly on its axis. "She's leaving Hartwell Industries?" "She's leaving the old way of doing business. There's a difference." As Eleanor explained Victoria's transition plan and the board's surprisingly supportive response, David watched Sophia demonstrate the proper method for preventing taco filling from escaping its shell. Her technique involved careful engineering and patient construction, principles that seemed oddly applicable to the work of building a more humane business world. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. "Victoria asked me to ask you something." "What's that?" "She wants to know if you'd consider a partnership. Not your company working for hers, but something equal. Something built from the ground up to prove that business can be both profitable and humane." David looked around his kitchen at Sophia's homework spread across the counter, at Mrs. Chen quietly cleaning up the dinner dishes, at the photographs on the refrigerator that captured the daily joy of their rebuilt life. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But David?" "Yeah? Whatever you decide, know that you've already changed more than you realize. The ripples from what you started are going to spread farther than any of us can imagine." After the call ended, David helped Sophia with her math homework while Mrs. Chen finished in the kitchen. The problems were simple addition and subtraction, the basic building blocks of numerical literacy, but Sophia approached them with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "Papa," she said as they worked through a particularly challenging word problem, "are you going to work with Eleanor and Victoria on something new?" "Maybe. What do you think about that?" Sophia chewed on her pencil eraser, considering the question with the seriousness she reserved for important decisions. "I think Mama would like that you're helping people be nicer to each other at work." The observation hit David with unexpected force. In all the business meetings and strategic discussions, he'd somehow lost sight of the simple truth at the heart of everything they were building. They were helping people be nicer to each other. It wasn't revolutionary or complex or theoretically sophisticated. It was just the radical act of treating people like human beings rather than resources to be optimized. You know what, Mija? I think you're right. As they finished the homework and began the nightly routine of baths and bedtime stories, David felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that kindness wasn't a weakness in business, it was a strength that had been undervalued for far too long. The bedtime story that night was one of Sophia's favoritisa tale about a garden where different flowers learned to grow together, sharing sunshine and rain, creating something more beautiful than any of them could achieve alone. As David read the familiar words, he realized it was also the story they'd been living for the past year. The story of how strangers could become partners, how competitors could become collaborators, how the simple act of refusing to compromise your principles could create ripples that changed everything. When the story ended and Sophia was settled in her bed with her protective circle of stuffed animals, she looked up at him with the solemn expression that preceded her most important questions. "Papa, are we going to help more people now?" "I think we are, Mija." "Good. The world needs more helpers." David kissed her forehead and turned out the light, leaving her to whatever dreams came to children who believed the world could be kinder than it appeared. In the quiet of his own room, David looked out the window at the city, spreading below them like a constellation of possibility. Somewhere in that maze of lights, people were making choices about how to treat each other, how to balance profit and principle, how to build something worth believing in. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that business could be a force for good in the world. But tonight, in the stillness of their small apartment where love had been rebuilt one patient day at a time, David Martinez felt the deep contentment that came from knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be.